Hey everyone, welcome to Salman's Automotive Mechanics 101. In this episode we'll be talking about transmission. What is transmission? Well, transmission is the method of taking the input speed from the engine and varying the speed to create an output speed. This can be done very simply if you imagine two gears. If this is the input gear, which is rotating, then this is output gear. Then this gear will rotate a lot slower, as it is big. The output gear is bigger than the input gear. If we were to switch these two around, however, if we were to switch these two around and this becomes the input gear and this becomes the output gear, then you would see that the output gear would be spinning a lot faster than the input gear. In both of these instances, the output gear has the same spins with the same torque as the input gear. Why do cars need transmission? Well, cars only produce the IC engine can only produce torque and efficient torque at a certain rev range. So transmission is there to take that efficient torque and use every speed. So then it makes the most of the engine, so it is most efficient. Also, engines can't produce their own torque from standstill very efficiently, so you have to go up the gears in order to reach speed. And also, going up a slope or over rough surfaces requires more torque, so if you were to put it into lower gear, that would give you more torque with each wheel spin. In transmission, you have gear ratios. A gear ratio is calculated by the output speed divided by the input speed. So if you were to say, take this input gear and let's say its speed is 10 miles an hour, and then you have the output speed, which is, because it's larger, it's going to be slower, so let's say it's 5 miles an hour. That would be 5 over 10, which makes our gear ratio 0.5. If you have an output gear that's smaller than the input gear, if the input gear is bigger than the output gear and the output gear is the smaller one that's turning quicker, then that would be 10 over 5, which is 2. If any gear ratio above 1 is called overdrive. This means that the output gear is moving faster than the input gear. To understand why a lower gear ratio means more torque per wheel spin, consider these two gears, this being the input and this being the output. If the gear ratio is 0.33, then for every 3 times the input gear will spin, the output gear will spin once. And this will mean that one spin of the input gear will mean a third of the spin for the output gear. This will mean that the output gear on a full rotation will have 3 times as much torque as one rotation of the input gear. Transmission in most cars with an internal combustion engine is the manual gearbox. It is comprised of the following parts. Excuse my shit drawing, a better one will be on screen. The crankshaft, which is, as I explained in the last video, where the power from the engine eventually comes to this crankshaft, which is turning. The lathe shaft, where all the gear ratios are, and the main shaft, which is where the gear ratio is selected and power goes to the wheels. Brief overview on how it works is the torque comes from the crankshaft, which will be spinning from the engine, and then along the lathe shaft will be the gear ratios. Let's say this is gear 1, 2 and 3. And these spin these gears which aren't connected to the main shaft yet. So these cause these gears to spin. So these gears will be spinning, and then the driver can select which gear ratio he'd like using this stick shift. If he were to choose gear 1, then he'd select it on the gearbox, which would move this socket to this gear, which would engage it with the main shaft. That would mean the torque, what the rate this is spinning at would be the rate the main shaft starts spinning at. If you wanted to change up to gear 2, this would move, this socket would move away from the first one and connect to the second gear ratio, which would engage that with the main shaft and disengage this gear ratio with the main shaft. So it would be spinning, the main shaft would be spinning with at the rate of the second gear ratio, and so on. As all three gear ratios will be spinning, a clutch pedal is needed so to disengage the engine from the crankshaft and the lay shaft, so then so that the gear can slow down so that the socket can attach. This is why you have to press the clutch every time you want to change up a gear or down a gear. It's because if you didn't, then the socket would be impossible to attach to a spinning gear. But with a clutch, the engine will disengage from the crankshaft, which means it'll stop spinning with such force and torque, meaning that the socket can attach itself to it. So to start the car, it would go into gear 1 first. This will provide the most amount of torque per spin of the wheels, and then they'll start to go up in gears. If they were on rough terrain, they would stay at the lower gears, probably 1, to keep the torque per wheel spin as high as it can be to overcome the slope or to go over rough terrain. And to go quickly on a racetrack or on a motorway, you'd select gear 3, which would provide the fastest spinning of the tires, fastest spinning of the wheels, but the least amount of torque per wheel spin, if you can imagine that. So to summarize, transmission is only found on an IC engine, cars with an IC engine, as they cannot produce all their torque from standstill. So they need to. That's why you need to go up the gears to eventually go quickly. They only produce efficient torque at certain RPM, if you imagine the graph again, and varying torque can help in certain situations. Say if you're on a smooth piece of motorway, you don't need that much torque, you just want the wheels to go a bit quicker, so that's why you'll have upper gears, and the lower gears will be for rough terrain or going up a slope. Thanks for watching, and tell me in the comments below what you'd like me to talk about next. Also, tell me if the mic is any good.